What you're about to hear will change the way you see children forever. A story so unbelievable, yet true, that it sent shockwaves across our quiet Arizona community last summer. In the dead of night, little Mason Wright stood before the bedroom wall, his tiny 2-year-old hands pressed against the plaster. Tears streamed down his cherubic face as he stared at the seemingly ordinary surface. His mother Brooke found him like this at 3 a.m., the third night in a row, whimpering one of his few words, "hurt," while most toddlers couldn't distinguish the sound of the air conditioning from a doorbell. Mason's eyes told a different story. He heard something inside that wall, something desperate, something dying. "Just the house settling," Connor insisted. "But how do you explain a baby who refuses to eat, yet sneaks his crackers to a solid wall, or who spills his sippy cup against the baseboard night after night?" Mason knew what the adults couldn't hear. A German Shepherd was cemented alive behind that wall. And what this baby did next left our entire town in tears. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Wright family had moved into the adobe-style ranch house on Saguaro Drive just 3 weeks ago, drawn by the spacious yard and the bargain price of a bank foreclosure. Connor, with his salt and pepper hair despite being only 34, had finally secured the management position at Desert Ridge Construction that would allow them to afford a real home. Brooke, perpetually exhausted from her night shifts at the pediatric ward, had fallen in love with the terracotta tiles and the way the morning light spilled across the kitchen counter. Neither of them had given much thought to the home's previous owner. The bank paperwork mentioned only a Frank Holloway, deceased. Just another casualty of the housing crisis. They'd assumed little Mason, with his mop of golden curls and eyes the color of the desert sky, had been diagnosed with developmental delays at his 18-month checkup. His vocabulary consisted of just 7 words: mama, dada, no, juice. More, doggy, and hurt. His pediatrician had suggested they start him in early intervention services once they were settled in their new home. "He'll catch up," Brooke would tell concerned relatives. "He understands everything we say. He just processes things differently." Martha Stevens from next door had been the first to welcome them, arriving with a casserole dish and the particular brand of nosiness that only a 78-year-old lifelong resident could perfect. Her silver hair was always set in the same tight perm, her floral house dresses ironed to crisp perfection. "You folks got yourselves quite the deal on old Frank's place," she'd said, eyes darting to every corner as she stepped inside. "Such a shame about him and that beautiful shepherd of his, Ranger. He called him most gentle creature God ever put on this earth," till Frank went peculiar. When Brooke had asked what happened to them, Martha's weathered face had tightened. "Nobody rightly knows. Frank started sending strange letters to the editor about government surveillance. Then one day, both him and that dog were gone. Sheriff found Frank's truck abandoned out by Copper Creek 3 months later. Never found Frank or the dog. That was, must be going on 9 months ago now." That first night, as Mason had screamed inconsolably pointing at his bedroom wall, neither parent connected the dots. They couldn't hear what their baby heard, the faint, desperate whimpering of something still alive, trapped within the very bones of their new home. On their 5th night in the new house, Brooke woke to the baby monitor crackling with Mason's distress. The digital clock read 2:17 a.m. as she fumbled for her slippers, the concrete floor cool beneath her feet despite the lingering heat of the Arizona summer day. "Mason. Sweetie. What's wrong?" she whispered, pushing open his bedroom door. The nightlight cast just enough glow to see her son standing in his dinosaur pajamas, pressed against the far wall, his tiny palms flat against the textured surface. "Hurt," he said, not turning to look at her. "Hurt." Brooke scooped him up, feeling the dampness of tears on his cheeks. "Did you have a bad dream?" "Buddy." His little body was rigid in her arms, his gaze still fixed on the wall. "I think he's just adjusting to the new house," Connor said the next morning over coffee, dark circles under his eyes matching hers. "Remember how my sister's kid cried for a week when they moved?" Brooke nodded, watching Mason push his Cheerios around the bowl without eating. "I guess. But this feels different. He keeps going to that same spot on the wall." Connor squeezed her shoulder as he stood to leave for work. "He'll be okay. Kids are resilient." By the third day of Mason refusing to eat, Brooke's nursing instincts overrode her desire to appear calm. She scheduled an emergency appointment with his pediatrician, who found nothing physically wrong. Sometimes toddlers protest changes in their environment by refusing food, Dr. Winters explained. "Try not to make mealtimes a battleground. He'll eat when he's hungry enough." But that evening, Brooke caught Mason doing something peculiar. He'd taken his sippy cup of water and a handful of crackers from his dinner plate and was carefully placing them in the corner of his room, right against the baseboard where the wall met the floor. "What are you doing, baby?" she asked. Mason looked up at her with those solemn blue eyes. "Doggy," he said simply, patting the wall. A chill ran through Brooke, despite the heat. Martha's words about Frank's missing German shepherd floated back to her. She knelt beside Mason. "There's a doggy." Mason nodded emphatically. "Doggy hurt." She told herself it was just a toddler's imagination. Perhaps he'd heard Martha mention a dog and created a fantasy friend. But that night, after Connor had fallen asleep, Brooke sat in Mason's room, watching her son's fitful slumber. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Then she heard it, so faint she thought she might have imagined it, a scratching sound, followed by what could have been a whimper, coming from inside the wall. "Connor," she shook her husband awake. "Connor, I heard something in Mason's wall." He groaned, covering his eyes with his forearm. "It's an old house. Brooke, probably mice." "It didn't sound like mice. It sounded like... I know this sounds crazy, but it sounded like a dog." Connor sat up, rubbing his face. "A dog in the wall. That's impossible." The next morning, Connor did a perfunctory inspection of the exterior walls, finding nothing unusual. "See no holes. No way for an animal to get in there." But Mason's behavior grew more concerning. He began refusing to leave his room, standing sentinel by the wall for hours. He'd place his ear against it, then look up at Brooke with such distress that it broke her heart. When Martha Stevens came by with a pie that afternoon, Brooke hesitantly mentioned Mason's fixation. "He keeps saying there's a hurt dog in his wall," Brooke explained, embarrassed to be voicing something so irrational. Martha's hand trembled as she set down her teacup. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "That poor creature." "What do you mean?" Martha's eyes darted nervously. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but Frank wasn't right in the head those last months. Kept saying his dog was spying on him for the government." She leaned closer. "Week before he disappeared, I saw him mixing up concrete in his backyard. Middle of July. Hot as blazes. Thought he was fixing his patio." She paused. "But he was wheeling it into the house instead." Brooke felt the blood drain from her face. "You don't think—" "I don't know what to think." Martha cut her off. "But that boy of yours, my grandma would have said he's got the knowing. Some souls just do." That night, while Mason finally slept, exhausted from his vigil, Brooke convinced Connor to join her in their son's room. "Just listen," she pleaded. "Just for a few minutes." They sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes, Connor's impatience growing visibly until there it was again, a feeble scratching, followed by a sound so pitiful it could only be described as a moan. "Jesus Christ," Connor whispered, the color draining from his face. "That's not mice." The next morning, Connor called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. He brought home a stud finder and carefully mapped the wall in Mason's room. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, marking areas with painter's tape. "The wall readings are inconsistent. This section here," he pointed to the corner Mason favored. "It's much thicker than it should be." While Mason napped his first daytime sleep in days, Brooke searched the house for any clue about its previous owner. In a forgotten corner of the attic, she found a box the cleaners had missed. Inside were notebooks filled with increasingly paranoid writings. "They're using Ranger to monitor my thoughts." One entry read, "I can see it in his eyes. They've implanted something in him. The only way to block the signal is to contain it in concrete. The walls will shield me." Brooke's hands shook as she read the final entry, dated just 2 days before Frank was reported missing. "I've sealed the surveillance device in the north bedroom wall. The concrete will block its transmissions, but it keeps making noise. I can still hear it trying to reach them." She brought the notebooks to Connor, who was now tapping sections of the wall with increasing urgency. Mason had woken and resumed his position, tiny hands pressed against the plaster. "We need to open this wall," Brooke said, showing Connor the journals. "Now." Connor hesitated, his practical nature warring with the evidence before him. Breaking into a load-bearing wall could compromise the house's structure. We should call someone, who the police, and tell them that our 2-year-old thinks a dog is trapped in our wall. Brooke's voice rose. "By the time we convince anyone, it could be too late. If there's even the slimmest chance." Mason looked up at them, his blue eyes wide and pleading. "Doggy," he said, patting the wall. "Doggy hurt." Connor stared at his son for a long moment, then nodded grimly. "I'll get my tools." Connor worked methodically, first drilling a small exploratory hole into the section of wall that had shown the most unusual density on the stud finder. When he withdrew the bit, Mason became agitated, reaching for the hole and trying to peer inside. "Let me check first, buddy," Connor said gently, positioning a flashlight and peering through. His sharp intake of breath told Brooke everything. "What is it?" she asked, holding Mason back as he struggled to approach the wall. "There's definitely a hollow space that shouldn't be there," Connor said. his voice tight. "And I think I see fur." Brooke's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God." Connor straightened up, his face set with determination. "I'm going to cut into the drywall. Keep Mason back." As Connor worked, carefully cutting a square into the wall with a drywall saw, Mason grew increasingly agitated. He began to whimper in concert with the faint sounds now more clearly emanating from within the wall. "Doggy hurt," he repeated over and over, tears streaming down his face. His distress mirrored whatever suffering lay behind that barrier. When Connor finally removed the square of drywall, they were confronted with a layer of concrete. "Jesus," he muttered. "He really did it. The sick bastard actually cemented something in here." "We need to get through it," Brooke insisted, her nurse's training kicking in. "If there's any chance the dog is still alive?" Connor nodded grimly and retrieved a hammer and chisel from his truck. The work was painstaking. He had to break through the concrete without risking injury to whatever might lie beyond. Mason watched with an intensity unnatural for a 2-year-old, his little body tense with anticipation. After 20 minutes of careful chiseling, a crack appeared in the concrete. A foul odor seeped through, a mixture of waste and decay that made Brooke gag. Yet it was unmistakably the smell of something still living. "Call Dr. Thompson," Connor said without looking up, continuing his work. "Tell her to come now, and bring water, room temperature, not cold." Brooke made the call with shaking hands, trying to explain the situation to the veterinarian who had treated their previous dog back in Phoenix. A dog cemented in a wall. For how long? "Doctor." Thompson's incredulity was clear even through the phone. "We think possibly months," Brooke replied, watching as Connor carefully widened the hole. "Please, Abby, I know how it sounds, but we need you." There was a pause before Dr. Thompson responded. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Have towels ready, and Pedialyte if you have it. Don't give the animal water directly, yet its system could be too compromised." By the time Connor had created an opening large enough to see inside, Mason was beside himself with anxiety. "Doggy, doggy," he kept saying, trying to wiggle past his father to see. What they found defied belief. In a space barely large enough to contain it lay the emaciated form of a German shepherd. Its fur was matted with filth, its body so thin that every rib was visible beneath its dull coat. A small drainage pipe had been cemented into the space, apparently allowing minimal moisture to seep in just enough to prevent immediate death, but nothing more. The dog's eyes were sunken, its breathing shallow and labored. "How is it still alive?" Brooke whispered, horror and pity warring in her voice. "Doggy," Mason said, his voice suddenly calm. He reached out toward the opening, and to their shock, the dog's tail moved just a feeble twitch, but unmistakable recognition. Connor worked frantically now, enlarging the hole enough to extract the animal. "We need to get him out of there. Can you grab those old towels from the garage?" As Brooke hurried to retrieve the towels, Martha Stevens appeared at the front door, apparently drawn by the commotion. "Lord have mercy," she gasped when she saw what they'd discovered. "It's Ranger. That's Frank's dog." Dr. Bob Thompson arrived moments later, her medical bag clutched tightly as she rushed into the house. The seasoned veterinarian stopped short at the sight before her, the half-demolished wall. the barely alive German shepherd now partially visible, and the tiny blond boy who stood watching with unnerving intensity. "I've been practicing for 20 years, she said, kneeling to examine the dog through the opening. "I've never seen anything like this. By all rights, this animal should be dead." "Can you help him?" Brooke asked, clutching Mason to her chest despite his struggles to break free. Dr. Thompson's face was grim. "I'll try. But you need to understand the level of starvation and dehydration here. It's beyond severe. Even if we get him out alive, the prognosis is extremely guarded." "We have to try," Connor insisted, continuing to carefully chip away concrete. "My son." And he glanced at Mason, who was watching the proceedings with those uncannily adult eyes. He knew. Somehow, he knew. It took another 30 minutes to create an opening large enough to extract the dog. During that time, Dr. Thompson prepared a makeshift emergency treatment area in the living room, laying out IV fluids and medications. "Easy now," she directed as Connor and Brooke gently lifted the German shepherd from his prison. "Support his head and hindquarters. His muscles are likely severely atrophied." The dog ranger, according to Martha, weighed a fraction of what a healthy German shepherd should. His body was little more than skin stretched over bone, and patches of fur had fallen out where his skin had been in constant contact with the concrete. As they laid him on the towels Dr. Thompson had arranged, Mason broke free from Brooke's grasp. Before anyone could stop him, he was kneeling beside the dog, his small hand gently touching Ranger's head. "Doggy better," he said with absolute certainty. Dr. Thompson worked quickly, inserting an IV catheter and beginning fluid therapy. "He's severely dehydrated," she explained as she worked. "We need to rehydrate him very carefully. Too fast could be as dangerous as the dehydration itself." While the veterinarian worked, Connor pulled Brooke aside. "We need to call the police," he said quietly. "This is animal cruelty. And if Holloway did this—" He glanced toward Mason, lowering his voice further. "If he did this to his dog, who knows what else he might have done before he disappeared?" Brooke nodded, her face pale. "Martha," she called to the neighbor who was hovering anxiously nearby, "could you watch Mason for a moment while we make some calls?" But Mason refused to be separated from Ranger. He sat beside the dog, occasionally stroking his head with a gentleness that belied his age. Most striking of all, the dog's eyes never left the boy's face, as though Mason was the only thing anchoring him to life. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Thompson murmured to Brooke. "It's almost as if they know each other." Sheriff Jim Callahan arrived an hour later, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the scene. At 62, he'd been Saguaro's sheriff for over 2 decades and prided himself on having seen it all. But even he seemed taken aback by the sight of the dog being treated in the living room and the hole in the bedroom wall. "Martha called me about Frank's strange behavior last year," he admitted, flipping through a small notebook. "Said he was acting paranoid, talking about government surveillance. But we had no grounds to do anything, no crime to having strange ideas." He shook his head, gazing at the emaciated form of Ranger. "Never imagined he'd do something like this, though always seemed to love that dog. Used to bring him to the diner every Sunday morning for breakfast." "Will Ranger survive?" Connor asked Dr. Thompson as she monitored the IV drip. The veterinarian's expression was cautious. "The next 48 hours will be critical. He's suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, muscle atrophy, and likely organ damage. The fact that he's survived this long is nothing short of miraculous." She glanced at Mason, who remained steadfastly by the dog's side. "If I were a superstitious woman, I'd say that boy has something to do with it," as if sensing they were talking about him. Mason looked up. "Doggy, stay," he said firmly, his small hand resting protectively on Ranger's bony shoulder. Brooke and Connor exchanged a look laden with questions neither could answer. How had their son known? What connection existed between this suffering animal and their 2-year-old child? And what other secrets might their new home be harboring? The next 72 hours unfolded in a blur of sleepless vigilance. Dr. Thompson made the unprecedented decision to treat Ranger in the right home rather than transport him to her clinic. Fearing the move might prove fatal in his fragile state, she converted the living room into a makeshift veterinary ICU, complete with IV stands, monitoring equipment borrowed from her practice, and a nest of blankets where Ranger lay, barely clinging to life. "In my professional opinion, he shouldn't even be alive," she confided to Brooke on the second evening, checking Ranger's vital signs for the 10th time. The level of dehydration and starvation. "I've never seen an animal survive conditions this severe." Brooke watched as Mason sat cross-legged beside Ranger's makeshift bed, solemnly offering the dog a sippy cup of water that Dr. Thompson had approved. "Maybe he had help," she said quietly. News of the discovery spread through Saguaro with the speed only possible in a town of under 5,000 souls. By the second day, a steady stream of visitors arrived at the Wright home, some bringing food for the family, others simply wanting to glimpse the miracle dog and the toddler who had somehow known he was there. "It's like something out of a storybook," Meredith from the local bakery whispered to her friend loud enough for Brooke to overhear. "That baby boy heard what no one else could. Makes you wonder what else children know that we can't hear." Not all the attention was supportive. Connor overheard Jeff Miller, their neighbor from 3 doors down, speaking to another man on his front lawn. "Property values are going to tank if word gets out about corpses and walls," Jeff complained. "Bad enough we got the water issues. Now we're going to be known as the town where some nut job entombed his dog." Connor chose not to engage, too exhausted from alternating shifts with Brooke to monitor Ranger around the clock. Instead, he focused on sorting through the box of Frank Holloway's belongings Brooke had found in the attic. The journals painted a disturbing portrait of a man's descent into paranoia. Frank had been a retired mechanical engineer, a widower who had moved to Saguaro 5 years earlier seeking peace in his golden years. Ranger had been his service dog, though Frank's journals never specified what condition had warranted one. "Listen to this," Connor said to Brooke late that night, while Mason finally slept curled up next to Ranger's bed. "Ranger saved my life again today, pulled me from the creek when the seizure hit. Don't know how he knows before they happen, but he always does. Best decision I ever made was getting him after Margaret passed." So Ranger was a seizure-alert dog, Brooke mused. Sipping lukewarm coffee, Connor nodded, flipping through more pages. But then about a year ago, the entries start changing. Frank begins writing about headaches, confusion, says he's hearing things, seeing things, and he becomes convinced someone's spying on him. He read another passage. "Ranger keeps staring at the corners of the room. He knows they're watching us. I've checked him for implants but can't find anything. Still, I know they're using him somehow. He's not the same dog anymore." "That poor man," Brooke sighed. "He was clearly becoming ill. Why didn't anyone help him?" "Martha said she tried," Connor replied. "Apparently, she called Adult Protective Services once, but Frank was lucid when they visited, knew exactly how to present himself." Dr. Thompson joined their late-night vigil, checking Ranger's IV line. It's not uncommon for people with developing dementia or other neurological conditions to become paranoid. They often focus that paranoia on those closest to them. "Even a beloved pet?" Brooke asked. "Doctor?" Thompson nodded grimly. "Especially those they depend on. The betrayal feels more personal somehow." On the third morning, Ranger showed the first promising signs of improvement. His eyes tracked movement more alertly, and he managed to lap a small amount of special rehydration fluid from a shallow bowl. Most remarkably, when Mason toddled into the living room for his morning visit, Ranger's tail thumped weakly against the blankets. "Would you look at that?" Dr. Thompson said, genuine amazement in her voice. "He recognizes your boy." Sheriff Callahan returned that afternoon with a forensics team to examine the wall cavity more thoroughly. Connor took Mason to the backyard while they worked, not wanting him to witness the grim proceedings. "Find anything?" Brooke asked when the sheriff emerged from the bedroom, his expression troubled. "Nothing definitive about what happened to Frank," he replied, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "But we did find this." He held up an evidence bag containing a small notebook. It was wedged behind the concrete, like he wanted someone to find it eventually. The notebook contained Frank's final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand. The last page, dated 3 days after the final entry in the journals Connor had found, sent chills down Brooke's spine. "What have I done? Sealed Ranger in the wall 2 days ago. Thought he was transmitting my thoughts to them. Now the medicine Dr. Patton gave me is working, and my head is clearing. I can hear him crying. God forgive me. What have I done? Tried breaking through with hammer, but too weak. Going to get help." "He never made it to get help," Sheriff Callahan explained. "His truck was found abandoned by Copper Creek, but we never found him. Always assumed he'd wandered off, maybe fallen into the creek, with his history of seizures. So he tried to save Ranger in the end," Brooke said softly. "He realized what he'd done." "Too little, too late," Connor muttered from the doorway, having returned with Mason. The toddler immediately made a beeline for Ranger, who visibly brightened at the child's approach. Dr. Thompson had been studying Mason's interactions with Ranger with increasing interest. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "German Shepherds are incredibly intelligent dogs, and service dogs like Ranger are specially trained to detect subtle physiological changes, shifts in breathing, heart rate, even scent markers that might indicate a seizure or other medical event." "What are you suggesting?" Brooke asked. "Mason's developmental pediatrician mentioned he might have sensory processing differences." "Right. Children on that spectrum often experience sensory input differently. Sounds might be louder, smells stronger. I wonder if Mason was somehow detecting Ranger's distress at a frequency or intensity the rest of us couldn't perceive." "You're saying there might be a scientific explanation for how Mason knew?" Connor asked, clearly relieved at the possibility of a rational answer. Dr. Thompson shrugged. I'm saying extraordinary connections between humans and animals don't have to be supernatural to be remarkable. Later that evening, while reviewing more of Frank's journals, Connor made another discovery. Frank writes a lot about the water here, says it tastes metallic, that he installed filters but still doesn't trust it. The whole county's been having issues with the water supply, Martha confirmed when she stopped by with dinner for the family. Something to do with that new mining operation up north. They swear it's safe, but folks have been complaining of headaches, rashes. Some even say it's affecting their thinking. Connor frowned. I've been working on a construction site near that mine. The company had us install special filtration systems in all the executive housing units, but told us it was just a premium amenity. You think Frank's paranoia might have been triggered by contaminated water? Brooke asked, the implications dawning on her. I don't know, Connor admitted, but it might explain why no one took his behavior seriously. If others were experiencing similar symptoms, maybe his just progressed faster or hit harder because of his age or existing health issues. On day 5, Ranger attempted to stand for the first time. Dr. Thompson had warned them his muscle atrophy was severe, and recovery would be a long, painful process if it was possible at all. Yet when Mason entered the room that morning, Ranger struggled to his feet, his legs trembling violently with the effort. Good Lord, Martha whispered, watching from the doorway. That dog's got more determination than a June bug on a porch light. Ranger managed to stay upright for nearly 30 seconds before collapsing back onto his bed, exhausted but triumphant. Mason clapped his hands in delight, then shocked everyone by clearly saying, Good boy, Ranger. Did he just... Connor started. He said Ranger's name. Brooke confirmed, tears springing to her eyes. That's a new word for him. Progress continued steadily after that breakthrough. Ranger gained strength daily, each small victory celebrated by the growing community of supporters who followed his recovery. A local reporter wrote a front-page story for the Saguaro Sentinel, complete with photos of Mason sitting protectively beside the recovering shepherd. The article caught the attention of a national morning show, which sent a film crew to document the extraordinary bond between the toddler and the dog he had saved. As public interest grew, so did donations to cover Ranger's extensive medical care, eventually overflowing into a fund Dr. Thompson established for other abused animals. Not everyone appreciated the attention. However, a small but vocal group of neighbors, led by Jeff Miller, began complaining about the constant stream of visitors disrupting the quiet street. More troublingly, anonymous calls to animal control suggested the Wrights were exploiting Ranger for publicity. This is ridiculous, Connor fumed after yet another surprise inspection from county animal welfare officers. We're trying to help him recover, not use him for some sick publicity stunt. Some folks just can't stand to see good things happening if they're not at the center of it, Martha observed sagely. Been that way since the beginning of time. As Ranger's physical condition improved, Dr. Thompson began discussing his long-term future. Legally, since Frank Holloway is presumed deceased with no known heirs, Ranger would typically go to a shelter or rescue organization once he's recovered. No, Mason said firmly, surprising everyone with his vehemence. The toddler had been adding new words to his vocabulary daily, many of them related to Ranger. Ranger stay. Brooke and Connor exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed adopting the shepherd permanently, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to imagine their home without him, or to picture separating him from Mason. "He does seem to have formed an extraordinary bond with your son," Dr. Thompson acknowledged. "In my professional opinion, separating them could be detrimental to both of their recoveries." "What do you mean, both of their recoveries?" Connor asked. Dr. Thompson smiled gently. "Haven't you noticed Mason's development has accelerated dramatically since Ranger came into your lives? He's using more words every day, engaging more, showing fewer signs of the delays that concerned his pediatrician." It was true. The withdrawn, sometimes frustrated toddler had blossomed in Ranger's presence. Where before he had struggled to communicate his needs, he now spoke in short but clear phrases, especially when they related to the dog's care. "Ranger needs water," he would announce, or "Ranger hurt leg," when the shepherd put too much weight on a still-healing limb. 2 weeks after Ranger's rescue, Sheriff Callahan arrived with somber news. A hiker had discovered human remains in a remote area of Copper Creek Ravine. Dental records confirmed they belonged to Frank Holloway. "Looks like he fell," the sheriff explained. "Might have been trying to climb down to reach his truck after it stalled on the Ridge Road. With his history of seizures, well, he might have had an episode at the worst possible moment." "So he really was trying to get help for Ranger," Brooke said softly. "Seems that way," the sheriff agreed. "Found a half-written note in his pocket about needing concrete removal equipment. Poor soul probably realized what he'd done once his medication kicked in. Tried to make it right." The confirmation of Frank's death brought a strange sense of closure. The final piece of the puzzle seemed to fall into place when Connor, increasingly suspicious about the local water quality, sent samples from their tap to be independently tested. The results were disturbing. While within legal limits, the water showed elevated levels of heavy metals, including lead, known to cause neurological symptoms, including confusion, paranoia, and cognitive decline when exposure is prolonged. "It's not high enough to cause immediate health effects in most people," explained Dr. Landry, the environmental medicine specialist Connor had consulted. "But for someone elderly, or with pre-existing conditions like seizures, it could absolutely exacerbate neurological symptoms or medication side effects." "And they're telling people this water is safe to drink." Brooke was appalled. "Technically, it meets the minimum federal standards," Dr. Landry replied. "Those standards haven't been updated in decades, despite new research suggesting harm at much lower levels of exposure." Armed with this information, Connor approached his construction company about the special filtration systems they'd installed in the executive homes. His supervisor's evasive response only fueled his suspicions. "Just focus on your job, right?" the man had said. "Those water quality rumors are bad for business, and questioning them is bad for your career." That evening, as Ranger managed his longest walk yet a full circuit of the living room with only minimal support from the sling Dr. Thompson had provided, Connor shared his growing concerns with Brooke. "I think the mining company knew the water was contaminated," he said quietly, watching Mason guide Ranger back to his bed. "I think they provided filtration for their executives but kept it quiet from everyone else." "That would explain why Frank's symptoms got so bad," Brooke mused. "He was retired, home all day drinking unfiltered tap water, while younger, healthier people who were at work most of the day had less exposure. And now they're worried about Rumors affecting property values, Connor added bitterly. As if people's health matters less than real estate prices. As they talked, neither noticed Mason had stopped playing with Ranger. The toddler stood perfectly still, staring at the hallway leading to his bedroom, the same bedroom where they'd found Ranger entombed in the wall. "Mama," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Someone else in the wall." Brooke's blood ran cold. "What did you say?" "Sweetie." Mason pointed down the hallway toward his bedroom, his expression unnervingly serious for a 2-year-old. "Someone else. In wall." Connor and Brooke exchanged alarmed glances. After everything they'd discovered about Frank Holloway, the contaminated water, and the miracle of finding Ranger alive, the implications of Mason's words were too disturbing to ignore. "He's probably just confused," Connor said quietly to Brooke. "The excitement of the day, all the people coming and going." But Ranger, who had been resting peacefully on his bed, suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked forward, alert and focused in the direction Mason was pointing. A low, cautious growl rumbled in his throat. "I don't like this," Brooke whispered, instinctively pulling Mason closer to her side. "I'll check it out," Connor said, trying to sound confident despite the chill that had settled in his stomach. "It's probably nothing. Maybe just a mouse in the walls this time." As Connor headed toward Mason's bedroom, Dr. Thompson, who had been packing up some of her medical supplies in the kitchen, joined Brooke in the living room. "Everything okay, I heard?" Ranger growled. Before Brooke could answer, a thunderous crash echoed from the bedroom, followed by Connor's startled shout. Brooke scooped up Mason and rushed down the hallway with Dr. Thompson close behind. They found Connor standing in the middle of Mason's room, staring at the partially opened wall where they'd rescued Ranger. At his feet lay a section of drywall that had given way, revealing another part of the hidden cavity they hadn't fully explored. "Connor, what happened?" Brooke asked, keeping Mason firmly in her arms despite his struggles to get down. Connor's face was ashen. "I was just checking around the repair area, and this section, it just crumbled away." He pointed to the newly exposed cavity. "There's something else in there." Dr. Thompson moved closer, peering into the darkness. "We need more light." Connor retrieved a flashlight from his tool belt and shone it into the cavity. The beam illuminated something that made all 3 adults gasp simultaneously. Tucked behind the section where Ranger had been imprisoned was a small space containing what appeared to be a metal box, and, beside it, the unmistakable shape of a human hand, mummified and partially decomposed, but clearly human. "Oh my God!" Brooke choked, turning to shield Mason's eyes. "Is that—" "Call Sheriff Callahan." Connor interrupted, his voice strained. "Now." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the Wright home once again became the center of a police investigation. Sheriff Callahan arrived with a forensics team, and the family was asked to remain in the living room while the investigators worked. Mason, remarkably, seemed unperturbed by the commotion, focusing instead on Ranger, who had grown increasingly agitated as more strangers entered the house. "It's okay, boy," Mason soothed, patting the shepherd's head with a gentleness that belied his age. "Good dog." Martha Stevens arrived as news of the discovery spread through the neighborhood grapevine. "Land's sakes," she muttered. settling into the armchair across from Brooke. What else did that poor addled man hide in these walls? After what seemed like an eternity, Sheriff Callahan emerged from Mason's bedroom, his weathered face grim. "Well," he began, removing his hat, "it's not Frank Holloway in there, if that's what you were wondering." "Then who is it?" Connor demanded. "Can't say for certain yet until the medical examiner completes an identification. But based on personal effects found with the remains, we believe it's Theodore Blackburn." The name meant nothing to Brooke or Connor, but Martha gasped. "Teddy Blackburn. That can't be right. He moved to Florida 5 years ago. Sent me a Christmas card the first year. Then nothing." Sheriff Callahan nodded solemnly. "That's what everyone thought. Ms. Stevens? But it appears Mr. Blackburn never made it to Florida." He turned back to Connor and Brooke. "Mr. Blackburn owned this house before Frank Holloway, sold it to him, and supposedly moved to be near his daughter in Tampa. Nobody questioned it because the sale was legitimate. Paperwork all in order." "Are you saying Frank Holloway murdered the previous owner and hid him in the wall?" Brooke asked, unconsciously tightening her hold on Mason. "We can't jump to conclusions," the sheriff cautioned. "But we did find something interesting in that metal box buried with the remains." He held up an evidence bag containing several vials and what looked like a prescription pad. "Looks like Mr. Blackburn was operating a small-scale prescription drug operation, forging scripts, selling medications, and Frank Holloway's name appears in what appears to be a customer ledger." Connor's brow furrowed. "So Frank was buying drugs from Blackburn, anti-seizure medications, among other things," Sheriff Callahan confirmed. "Seems Blackburn was exploiting folks with chronic conditions, charging them premium prices for medications they desperately needed." Dr. Thompson, who had remained to monitor Ranger during the investigation, spoke up. "That could explain a lot. If Frank was dependent on Blackburn for his seizure medication, and then suddenly Blackburn moved away, Frank might have been suffering from withdrawal on top of the effects of the contaminated water." Brooke finished the thought. "No wonder his mental state deteriorated so rapidly. As they processed this new information, the temperature in the house suddenly plummeted. The air conditioning, which had been struggling against the relentless Arizona summer heat, abruptly kicked into overdrive, sending frigid air pouring through the vents. "Blasted thing's been acting up since we moved in," Connor muttered, moving to adjust the thermostat. But as he reached for it, the power throughout the house failed, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the flashlights of the forensics team in Mason's bedroom. "Everyone stay calm," Sheriff Callahan called out. "Probably just blew a fuse with all our equipment." Ranger, who had been relatively calm despite the strangers in the house, suddenly began to growl, his gaze fixed on the hallway. Mason, still in Brooke's arms, pointed toward the same spot. "Bad man," he said clearly, his small voice somehow carrying over the confusion. "Bad man hurt Ranger's friend." A chill that had nothing to do with the malfunctioning air conditioning ran through Brooke. What does he mean? Ranger's friend, Dr. Thompson, who had moved to comfort the agitated shepherd, frowned thoughtfully. "Sheriff, you said Frank Holloway had been buying seizure medication from Blackburn. Was Frank diagnosed with epilepsy?" "According to the medical records we found after his disappearance, Yes, the sheriff confirmed. Had his first seizure about 7 years ago, after his wife passed. That's why he got Ranger. He was a trained seizure alert dog. So Ranger would have known Blackburn. Dr. Thompson mused. If he was Frank's service dog during that time, he would have been present for any interactions between the two men. As if in confirmation, Ranger's growl deepened, his eyes still fixed on the darkened hallway. In the beam of a deputy's flashlight, they could see his hackles raised, his posture alert but defensive. "I think," Dr. Thompson said slowly, "that Ranger might be reacting to memories triggered by the discovery. Service dogs are incredibly attuned to their owners' emotional states. If Ranger witnessed hostility between Frank and Blackburn..." The power suddenly returned, lights flickering back to life throughout the house. The air conditioning reset itself, humming at a normal level, the momentary tension broken. Sheriff Callahan continued his explanation. "Based on what we've found so far, we have a working theory. Blackburn was selling medications to vulnerable people in the community, including Frank Holloway. Something went wrong between them, maybe a dispute over money. Maybe Frank discovered the prescriptions were forged. There was an altercation that ended with Blackburn dead, and Frank hid the body in the wall." Connor finished, his expression grim. "It appears that way," the sheriff agreed. But then, as the contaminated water affected his neurological condition, exacerbated by inconsistent medication, Frank's mental state deteriorated. He began experiencing paranoia, perhaps hallucinations. In his confused state, he somehow associated Ranger with Blackburn. Maybe the dog kept returning to the spot where the body was hidden, as dogs sometimes do. "So he sealed Ranger in the wall, too," Brooke whispered, the horror of it all sinking in. Next to the man he'd killed. Once his medication stabilized, he realized what he'd done to Ranger and tried to save him. Dr. Thompson added, "But by then, it was too late. He fell trying to get help, and both secrets remained hidden in these walls until Mason somehow sensed Ranger was still alive." Throughout this grim discussion, Mason had remained uncharacteristically still in Brooke's arms, his eyes moving between the adults as if following their conversation. Now, he squirmed to be put down. When Brooke hesitantly set him on his feet, he toddled over to Ranger and wrapped his arms around the shepherd's neck. "Ranger good," he announced firmly. "Ranger stay." Despite the macabre discoveries, despite the growing realization that their dream home harbored multiple dark secrets, Brooke felt a surge of fierce protectiveness watching her son with the dog he had saved against all odds. "What happens now?" she asked Sheriff Callahan. "Now we complete our investigation," he replied. "The medical examiner will need to confirm the identity of the remains and determine cause of death. You folks will need to find somewhere else to stay for a few days while we process the scene." "You can stay with me," Martha offered immediately. "Got plenty of room since my Herbert passed, and I'd welcome the company." As the adults discussed logistics, the temperature in the house began to fluctuate again, the lights flickering ominously. One of the deputies emerged from Mason's bedroom, his expression concerned. "Sheriff, you might want to take a look at this," he said. "The wall cavity extends further than we thought. There's some kind of access to the foundation, and we're picking up readings that suggest..." Well, you should see for yourself. The room grew uncomfortably warm as the air conditioning faltered once more. Outside, the relentless Arizona sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the windows. In the dimming light, Mason suddenly pointed to the ceiling vent directly above Ranger's bed. "Water bad," he said with startling clarity. "Making everyone sick." Connor's head snapped up. "What did you say, buddy?" "Water bad," Mason repeated, making a drinking motion with his hand. "Hurt Frank, hurt Ranger, hurt everyone." Dr. Thompson knelt beside Mason, her expression gentle but serious. "Mason, how do you know the water is bad?" Instead of answering, Mason tugged at Ranger's blanket, pulling it back to reveal something they hadn't noticed before, a folded piece of paper that had been tucked beneath the shepherd's bed. Connor reached for it, carefully unfolding what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "It's the county water system," he said in disbelief, studying the crude diagram, with markings showing showing where the mining company connected their waste disposal directly into the municipal water supply. Sheriff Callahan took the map, his expression darkening as he examined it. This would explain a lot about the health complaints we've been getting. Where did this come from? All eyes turned to Ranger, who sat calmly now, his intelligent gaze moving between the humans as if waiting for them to understand. Blackburn must have known. Brooke realized aloud. Maybe that's the real reason he was killed, not because of the prescription drugs, but because he discovered what the mining company was doing to the water. And Frank found this evidence when he... Connor couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. "When he hid Blackburn's body," Sheriff Callahan completed grimly. But in his deteriorating mental state, he hid the evidence too. Maybe even forgot about it as his condition worsened. "Until he sealed Ranger in with it," Dr. Thompson added softly. "Perhaps on some level. He was trying to protect both the dog and the proof of what was making everyone sick." As if to punctuate her words, the house's electrical system surged dramatically, lights blazing to painful brightness before plunging them into darkness once more. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear a new sound, water rushing through the pipes inside the walls, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. "Everybody out!" Sheriff Callahan commanded as the rushing water sound intensified. "Now!" Connor scooped up Mason while Brooke and Dr. Thompson quickly gathered Ranger, supporting his still weak body between them. The shepherd whimpered as they hurried toward the front door, his eyes fixed on the hallway leading to Mason's bedroom, as if reluctant to leave. "The evidence," Connor started, turning back toward the kitchen where the map had been left. "Leave it," Sheriff Callahan ordered. "My deputy has photos. Nothing in there is worth risking your lives for." They stumbled onto the front lawn just as water began seeping from beneath the front door. Not the clear water of a burst pipe, but a murky, foul-smelling liquid with an unmistakable metallic odor. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the sight of police vehicles still parked along the street. "Sweet Jesus," Martha gasped, clutching her cardigan around her shoulders despite the evening heat. "What in heaven's name is happening now?" "Looks like a main line rupture," Sheriff Callahan said grimly, watching as the contaminated water began pooling around the foundation of the Wright home. "And given what we just discovered about the mining company's waste disposal practices, I'd say this is no accident. Within minutes, the water flow intensified. Dark liquid now streaming from every opening in the house doors, windows, even seeping through tiny cracks in the stucco exterior. The acrid smell grew stronger, causing several onlookers to cover their noses and retreat to a safer distance. "That ain't normal water," observed Bill Henderson from 2 doors down, a retired plumber whose opinion carried weight in such matters. "That's industrial runoff if I ever smelled it." By the time emergency services arrived, fire trucks, utility company vehicles, and additional police units, the Wright home sat in the center of a dark pool that was rapidly spreading across the front yard. Environmental hazard teams in protective gear approached cautiously, taking samples and establishing a perimeter. "Your home isn't safe," Sheriff Callahan told the Wrights as they watched from Martha's driveway. "And given what we've discovered, it may not be safe for quite some time." Brooke clutched Connor's arm. Mason held tightly against her chest. The toddler had remained eerily calm throughout the evacuation, but now he began to fuss, reaching toward Ranger, who lay exhausted on a blanket Martha had provided. "What exactly did you find in our wall?" Connor asked the sheriff, his voice low to avoid being overheard by the growing crowd of neighbors. Sheriff Callahan glanced around before responding. "Your wall cavity connects to an old maintenance tunnel that runs beneath several properties in this subdivision. Based on the map and our preliminary findings, the mining company has been using that tunnel to illegally dispose of contaminated wastewater directly into the municipal supply." "That's why everyone's been getting sick," Brooke whispered, the horror of it sinking in. "The headaches, the confusion." "Frank's paranoia," Connor added. It wasn't just his condition or medication. He was being poisoned, like everyone else. The company executives knew. Dr. Thompson interjected, still monitoring Ranger's condition while listening to their conversation. "That's why they installed special filtration systems in their own homes, as you discovered." "Connor." Sheriff Callahan nodded grimly. "And when Blackburn found out, maybe through his connections in the prescription drug black market, maybe just by accident, it became a liability the company couldn't afford." "So they killed him?" Brooke asked, instinctively covering Mason's ears, although the toddler was now more interested in comforting Ranger than listening to the adults. "That's what we need to determine," the sheriff replied. "But based on the evidence emerging, I'm beginning to think Frank Holloway may have been more victim than perpetrator in all this." As they spoke, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up across the street. A tall man in an expensive suit emerged, surveying the scene with obvious displeasure. He spoke briefly with one of the environmental response team members, his gestures becoming increasingly agitated as the conversation progressed. "That's Richard Daniels," Connor said, recognizing his company's CEO. "What's he doing here?" Before anyone could respond, Mason suddenly squirmed from Brooke's grasp and toddled toward Ranger. The shepherd, despite his weakness, struggled to rise, his attention now fixed on the man across the street. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Bad man," Mason said clearly, pointing at Daniels. "Hurt Frank. Hurt Ranger." Sheriff Callahan's eyes narrowed. "What's he saying?" "I don't know," Brooke admitted, moving to retrieve her son. "Mason, honey, come back here." But Mason stood his ground beside Ranger, his small hand buried in the shepherd's fur. "Bad man," he repeated, his voice somehow carrying across the commotion. Hurt everyone. Daniels turned at the sound, his gaze locking first on Mason, then shifting to Ranger. The color drained from his face as he recognized the German shepherd, a dog that by all rights should have been dead, entombed in concrete for months. Impossible, they heard him mutter, taking an involuntary step backward. Sheriff Callahan watched this reaction with interest. Mr. Daniels, he called out, crossing the street. Just the man I wanted to see. I have some questions about Saguaro Ridge Mining's waste disposal practices. What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts would differ in the details. Daniels glanced from the sheriff to Ranger to the toxic water still flowing from the right home. He reached into his jacket for his phone. He would later claim, but the motion was misinterpreted by the already tense police officers nearby. Hands where we can see them, shouted a deputy, drawing his weapon. Daniels froze, then suddenly bolted toward his vehicle. He made it 3 steps before slipping in the contaminated water that had now spread across the street. He fell hard, his head striking the curb with a sickening thud. The crowd gasped collectively as officers rushed to the fallen man. Blood mingled with the dark water pooling around him, creating a grotesque tableau that would feature in community nightmares for months to come. "Get an ambulance!" Sheriff Callahan shouted, kneeling beside Daniels despite the toxic liquid soaking his uniform pants. "And somebody get these civilians back." In the chaos that followed paramedics arriving, environmental teams expanding their hazard zone, neighbors being evacuated from the immediate vicinity, the Wrights huddled together on Martha's porch, watching their home and their neighborhood transform into a disaster zone. "What happens now?" Brooke asked, her voice barely audible above the emergency sirens. Connor shook his head, his arm tight around her shoulders. "I don't know. Our home is contaminated. My company is implicated in what looks like corporate negligence at best, criminal conspiracy at worst. And we're witnesses to—" He trailed off, glancing at Mason, who had finally fallen asleep against Ranger's side, both boy and dog exhausted by the day's events. "To something horrible," Brooke finished for him. "Something that's been happening right under everyone's noses for years." Dr. Thompson, who had remained to monitor Ranger despite the unfolding crisis, studied the sleeping pair with professional interest. "It's remarkable," she said softly. "Ranger should have died in that wall. By all medical logic, no dog could survive months with so little water, no food, and limited air. Yet somehow he did long enough for Mason to sense his presence and insist on saving him. And now Ranger has returned the favor," Connor observed. "If we hadn't found him, if we hadn't discovered Blackburn's remains and that map, the contamination would have continued," Sheriff Callahan confirmed, rejoining them after Daniels had been taken away in an ambulance, 2 deputies accompanying him. "People would have kept getting sick, perhaps dying, without ever knowing why." Brooke stroked Mason's hair as he slept. "But how did he know? He's just a baby." "Sometimes innocence sees what experience blinds us to," Martha offered, bringing out a tray of iced tea for the exhausted group. "My grandmama used to say the very young and the very old stand with one foot in this world and one in the next. They notice things the rest of us are too busy to see." As night fell fully, the emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the neighborhood. The Wright home, once their dream of a fresh start, now stood dark and quarantined, surrounded by hazard tape and illuminated by floodlights as investigators continued their work. Ranger stirred in his sleep, whimpering slightly. Mason, without waking, placed his small hand on the shepherd's head, and the dog immediately calmed. Whatever connection had formed between them, born of suffering, cemented by rescue, transcended explanation. "We've lost everything," Connor said finally, watching another environmental team truck arrive. "Our home, my job probably, our savings." "No," Brooke corrected him gently, looking at their son sleeping peacefully beside the dog he had saved against all odds. "We've lost things, Connor. Important things, valuable things, but not everything." She reached for his hand. "Not what matters most." The following days unfolded in a blur of hotel rooms, police interviews, and media attention that threatened to overwhelm the Wright family. Martha's generous offer of shelter had been superseded by environmental concerns. Her home, like the entire block, was placed under evacuation orders as testing revealed alarming levels of heavy metals and industrial chemicals in the soil and groundwater. Richard Daniels survived his fall but faced a barrage of legal troubles. His phone, seized as evidence following his attempted flight, contained damning emails documenting Saguaro Ridge Mining's deliberate contamination of the local water supply. More disturbing were the messages referencing the Blackburn situation and instructions to handle the Holloway problem permanently. "It's worse than we thought," Sheriff Callahan told Connor and Brooke on the third day, meeting them in a conference room at the Desert Palm Hotel where FEMA had temporarily housed the displaced residents. Daniels wasn't acting alone. Half the town council was receiving payments to look the other way, and the county health department falsified water quality reports for years. "How many people were affected?" Brooke asked, her nursing training making her acutely aware of the potential health implications. "Hard to say exactly," the sheriff replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Initial estimates suggest the entire water supply for Saguaro and 2 neighboring communities has been compromised to some degree. That's nearly 12,000 people. And nobody noticed." Connor's disbelief was palpable. "People noticed," Sheriff Callahan corrected him. "They reported headaches, rashes, confusion, memory problems, but the symptoms were attributed to desert living hard water, dry air, intense heat. The few doctors who raised concerns were dismissed as alarmists or pressured to remain silent." The revelation that multiple authority figures had colluded in the cover-up sent shockwaves through the community. As the investigation expanded, so did the divide among Saguaro's residents. Some, primarily those with connections to the mining company or town leadership, attempted to minimize the significance of the findings. Others, especially families with children showing unexplained health issues, demanded justice with increasing vehemence. Through it all, Mason remained strangely calm, his development continuing to accelerate in ways that amazed his pediatrician. His vocabulary expanded daily, his sentences growing more complex, particularly when speaking to or about Ranger. "It's as if a switch has been flipped," Dr. Winters remarked during a follow-up appointment arranged at the hotel. "The delays we were concerned about have virtually disappeared. I wouldn't go so far as to call it miraculous, but it's certainly remarkable." "Could it be related to getting away from the contaminated water?" Brooke asked, watching as Mason carefully arranged colored blocks into patterns far more complex than he'd managed just weeks earlier. Possibly, the pediatrician conceded. Heavy metal exposure is known to affect neurological development in children. Removing the source could allow for natural recovery. But honestly, she lowered her voice, the rate of improvement I'm seeing goes beyond what I'd expect from environmental factors alone. Ranger's recovery proved equally remarkable, though still underweight. His strength returned steadily under Dr. Thompson's care. The veterinarian had converted a section of her clinic into a comfortable space for the shepherd, complete with a child-sized cot, where Mason insisted on napping during their daily visits. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 20 years, Dr. Thompson told them, watching as Ranger completed his physical therapy exercises with growing confidence. And I've never seen anything quite like the bond between these two. It's as if they understand each other on a level that transcends normal human-animal communication. On the 10th day after the evacuation, as the full scope of the environmental disaster continued to unfold, the Wrights received an unexpected visitor at the hotel. Frank Holloway's sister, Catherine Barnes, had flown in from Oregon after seeing news reports about the discovery of Ranger and the subsequent investigation. I always knew Frank wouldn't abandon that dog, she told them, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she watched Mason and Ranger playing quietly in the corner of the hotel suite. When the police told me he'd disappeared and Ranger was missing too, I assumed they'd found each other wherever they ended up. The thought that Frank would harm him, she shook her head firmly. Never. That dog saved his life more times than I can count. We found some of Frank's journals, Connor told her. It seems the contaminated water affected his thinking, maybe interacted with his seizure medication. Catherine nodded sadly. Frank was the gentlest soul you'd ever meet before he got sick. After Margaret, his wife, passed, the seizures started, but he managed well with medication and Ranger at his side. Her expression hardened. Until he moved to Saguaro. Then the bizarre phone calls started, the paranoid letters. I tried to convince him to come stay with me, but he insisted they would follow him. Did he ever mention Theodore Blackburn? Brooke asked carefully. The man who sold him the house, only that he'd been helpful getting Frank's prescriptions filled when the insurance company gave him trouble. Catherine frowned. Wait, was Blackburn involved in all this? Sheriff Callahan, who had accompanied Catherine to the meeting, cleared his throat. We're still piecing together the exact sequence of events, ma'am. But it appears Mr. Blackburn discovered the mining company's illegal dumping practices and attempted to leverage that information, possibly by blackmailing company executives. And they silenced him, Catherine concluded grimly. Then tried to silence Frank when he stumbled onto the truth. The evidence suggests Frank may have witnessed Blackburn's murder. The sheriff continued carefully. Possibly by someone he trusted, his doctor, a town official, maybe even Richard Daniels himself. In his confused state, affected by the contaminated water and irregular medication, Frank hid Blackburn's body, but kept the evidence Blackburn had gathered. And in his paranoia, he associated Ranger with the trauma of what he'd witnessed, Dr. Thompson added. Service dogs are incredibly attuned to their owners' emotional states. Ranger would have sensed Frank's distress, perhaps even tried to lead him back to the hidden evidence repeatedly. So my brother wasn't crazy, Catherine said softly. Or at least, not in the way everyone thought. He was being poisoned and manipulated. And when he became a liability, they made sure he couldn't tell his story. Sheriff Callahan finished. We've reopened the investigation into Frank's death. The initial ruling of accidental death is now highly suspicious given what we know. As the adults continued their grim discussion, Mason approached with a crayon drawing a simple but recognizable depiction of a man with a dog. He handed it to Catherine with solemn ceremony. "Frank and Ranger," he said clearly. "They're okay now." Catherine accepted the drawing with trembling hands, visibly moved by the child's gesture. "Thank you, sweetheart. I believe they are." Later that evening, after Catherine had left with promises to stay in touch, Connor received a call from an unexpected source. James Whitfield, a senior partner at one of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms, requested a meeting with the Wright family at their earliest convenience. "I don't understand," Connor told Brooke after ending the call. "Whitfield and Associates represents half the corporate interests in Arizona. Why would they want to meet with us?" The answer came the following morning in the hotel's business center. James Whitfield, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, laid out a proposition that left them momentarily speechless. "My firm has been retained by a coalition of affected families," he explained, his voice carrying the polished tone of old money and Harvard law. "People whose health has been compromised by Saguaro Ridge Mining's actions. We're preparing a class action lawsuit that will likely become one of the largest environmental justice cases in state history." "And you're telling us this because," Connor prompted, "because your family, particularly your son, is central to the discovery of this conspiracy. Without Mason's extraordinary persistence, without your willingness to literally break down walls despite considerable skepticism, this contamination might have continued indefinitely." Brooke instinctively glanced toward the adjoining room where Mason was napping with Ranger. "We just did what any parents would do. We listened to our child. With respect, Mrs. Wright. Most parents would not have taken a toddler's fixation with a wall seriously enough to investigate. Most would have dismissed it as imagination or adjustment issues." Whitfield adjusted his gold cufflinks. "That decision to trust your son's perception over conventional explanations has potentially saved countless lives." "We're not looking for recognition," Connor said firmly. "And we certainly don't want Mason subjected to more attention than he's already experiencing." "Understood completely." Whitfield nodded. "However, there is the matter of your personal losses. Your home is essentially a hazardous waste site. Your employment prospects in the area are compromised due to your whistleblowing. And you've incurred significant expenses for Ranger's ongoing care." The lawyer opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the table. "This is a preliminary settlement offer from Saguaro Ridge Mining's parent company. They're eager to resolve your specific claims quickly and quietly, separate from the larger class action." Connor glanced at the figure on the bottom line and nearly choked. "This is a starting point," Whitfield said smoothly. "I believe we can negotiate for substantially more, particularly if the criminal investigations yield further evidence of deliberate targeting of your family." "Targeting?" Brooke echoed, her voice rising slightly. "What do you mean?" Whitfield's expression turned grave. "The investigators found something concerning when they analyzed your home's specific water connection. The concentration of contaminants was significantly higher than neighboring properties, almost as if someone had ensured your family received a more potent dose." "But why would anyone target us specifically?" Connor asked. "We had no connection to any of this when we bought the house." "Perhaps not directly," Whitfield acknowledged. But consider you purchased a home where evidence of corporate malfeasance was literally hidden in the walls. Mason began exhibiting unusual awareness of that hiding place immediately. And you, Connor, worked for a construction company with ties to the mining operation, with access to information about those special filtration systems. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Had someone arranged for them to purchase Frank Holloway's house, hoping the contaminated water would ensure any secrets remained undiscovered? Had Mason's developmental delays been not delays at all, but symptoms of targeted poisoning? There's something else you should know, Whitfield continued after allowing them a moment to process. Theodore Blackburn's daughter has come forward. She disputes the narrative that her father was involved in prescription fraud. According to her, he was a whistleblower who had contacted the EPA about the water contamination shortly before his disappearance. So, the prescription drug operation was, Connor began. A fabrication, Whitfield confirmed. Likely planted by the same people who murdered Blackburn and attempted to frame Frank Holloway for it. The same people who probably ensured Frank's fatal accident when his medications began to clear his system enough for him to realize what had happened. Brooke shuddered, instinctively reaching for Connor's hand across the table. And now they know we've discovered everything. Whitfield's next words did nothing to ease their growing apprehension. Which is why, in addition to discussing financial compensation, I've been authorized to offer you something perhaps more valuable in your current situation. He produced another document from his portfolio. Comprehensive relocation services, including new identities if necessary, until all parties responsible for this conspiracy are brought to justice. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning in Northern California, Mason Wright chased a butterfly across a sunlit yard. His peals of laughter blending with the rhythmic thumping of Ranger's tail against the porch steps. The German shepherd, now restored to his proper weight and gleaming coat, watched his young charge with attentive eyes, rising to follow when the toddler strayed too far from the house. "Ranger, look," Mason called. His vocabulary now typical for a 3-year-old, the developmental delays that had concerned his parents completely resolved. Butterfly blue from the kitchen window. Brooke watched the pair with a mixture of wonder and gratitude that still caught her by surprise at unexpected moments. So much had changed since that harrowing summer in Arizona. New names, new town, new beginning, yet the bond between her son and the shepherd remained unaltered, a constant in their dramatically transformed lives. "Still hard to believe, isn't it?" Connor asked, coming to stand beside her at the window. The past months had added a few strands of silver to his temples, but the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes in the aftermath of their discovery had finally begun to fade. "Which part?" Brooke smiled, leaning into his embrace. "That our 2-year-old found a dog cemented alive in a wall that said dog led to the uncovering of a massive corporate conspiracy, or that we're now living under the Witness Protection Program while the federal investigation continues." "All of it," Connor admitted, "but mostly that we're here, together, safe. There were moments when I wasn't sure that would be possible." The decision to accept Whitfield's offer of relocation had not come easily, leaving behind their identities, their careers, their connections to begin anew in a strange place had seemed drastic at first. But as the scope of Saguaro Ridge Mining's corruption became clearer, as the death threats began appearing, as Mason's night terrors intensified, the choice became inevitable. Now, 3 months into their new life as the Carson family, in a quiet Northern California community. The wisdom of that decision was evident. Mason thrived in his new preschool. Connor's skills had transferred seamlessly to a position with a sustainable construction company. Brooke had found part-time work at a local clinic. And Ranger, officially adopted and certified as Mason's therapy dog, had become a beloved neighborhood fixture. "Letter from Catherine came yesterday," Brooke mentioned, moving to retrieve an envelope from the counter. "She's testifying next week in the federal case." The investigation into Saguaro Ridge mining had expanded far beyond water contamination, revealing a web of corruption that encompassed corporate executives, local officials, and even federal regulators. Richard Daniels had turned state's evidence, providing details of environmental crimes spanning 2 decades in exchange for a reduced sentence. The case had grown to become one of the largest environmental prosecutions in American history, with damages expected to exceed $1 billion. Frank Holloway's reputation had been fully restored, his story recast from that of a mentally unstable recluse to a victim who had stumbled upon a deadly conspiracy. The evidence he had hidden, both Blackburn's documentation and his own observations, proved crucial in connecting Saguaro Ridge's activities to the neurological symptoms experienced throughout the community. "She says they've finally identified all the remains found on mining property," Connor said grimly, reading over Brooke's shoulder. 7 people total, including 2 environmental activists who disappeared in 2016. "Those poor families," Brooke murmured. "At least they have answers now." Through the window, they watched as Ranger suddenly perked up, his attention shifting from Mason to the road beyond their front yard. A familiar SUV approached Dr. Jessica Miller, formerly Dr. Abigail Thompson, another protected witness whose testimony about the medical effects of the contamination had made her a target for the same forces that had threatened the rights. "Ranger knew she was coming before we could see the car," Connor observed, never quite losing his sense of wonder at the shepherd's acute awareness. "Just like he always knows when Mason needs him." Dr. Miller had relocated to the same community at the marshal's suggestion, her expertise in veterinary medicine allowing her to establish a new practice while remaining close enough to continue monitoring Ranger's recovery. Her weekly visits had become a welcome ritual. "Jessica's bringing the test results," Brooke reminded him, referring to the comprehensive health assessment she had insisted upon for all of them, concerned about long-term effects from the contamination they had endured. Mason abandoned his butterfly chase as Dr. Miller's vehicle pulled into the driveway, racing to greet her with Ranger loping gracefully at his side. The transformation in the once dying dog remained nothing short of miraculous to everyone who had witnessed his rescue. "Dr. Jess, Dr. Jess," Mason called excitedly. "Ranger did his tricks, all of them. Did he now?" The veterinarian smiled, kneeling to greet both child and dog at their level. "Well, that certainly deserves a special treat, doesn't it?" Inside, over coffee and the homemade cookies that had become Dr. Miller's trademark contribution to these visits, she delivered the news they had been anxiously awaiting. "All clear," she announced, sliding folders across the kitchen table. "Every test normal. No lingering heavy metals, no organ damage, no neurological concerns." She smiled at Mason, who was showing Ranger his latest crayon masterpiece in the living room. "It's quite remarkable, considering the levels of exposure you all experienced." "So Mason's developmental issues," Brooke began, "were almost certainly related to the contamination." Dr. Miller confirmed, "and have resolved completely with clean water and clean air. He's testing above age level now in several cognitive areas." The relief that washed over both parents was palpable. Though Mason had seemed fully recovered, the fear of invisible, lasting damage had lingered in their minds. "And Ranger?" Connor asked. "Equally miraculous." Miller shook her head in continued amazement. "He's shown no lasting effects from his ordeal. His latest scans are those of a healthy 5-year-old German Shepherd. Medically speaking, his survival defies explanation." As if aware he was being discussed, Ranger padded into the kitchen, Mason following with his drawing held proudly aloft. "Look, Mommy! Look, Daddy! It's our family." The crayon illustration showed 4 figures standing before a simple house, 2 tall, clearly, Connor and Brooke, 1 small Mason himself, and 1 4-legged, unmistakably Ranger. Above them all, a yellow sun beamed down from a blue sky unmarred by clouds. "It's beautiful, sweetie," Brooke said, genuinely moved by the simple depiction of their reconstructed life. Later that evening, as golden light filtered through the trees surrounding their new home, the family gathered on the back porch. Mason sat on the steps, one arm draped around Ranger's neck, both of them watching a pair of hummingbirds dart among the feeder Connor had installed the previous weekend. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Brooke said softly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful tableau before them. "How close we came to losing everything." Connor nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "But we didn't, thanks to our extraordinary son and his equally extraordinary dog. Not just a dog," Mason corrected without turning around, his small voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness. "My best friend." Ranger's tail thumped against the wooden step in apparent agreement, his loyal eyes never leaving his young human companion's face. Whatever connection had formed between them forged in darkness, cemented through rescue, strengthened by mutual healing, remained undiminished by time or circumstance. In the face of corruption exposed, justice pursued, and a new life begun. Their bond stood as testament to the purest truth that had emerged from the nightmare. Sometimes the smallest hearts harbor the greatest courage, and compassion can break through even walls of concrete. Folks, this story of little Mason and Ranger reminds us of something our generation knows in our bones, but sometimes forgets. In this digital age, the purest wisdom often comes from the innocent. Back in our day, we listened when something didn't feel right. We trusted our instincts. This 2-year-old baby boy did what many grown adults failed to do. He believed what his heart told him, even when everyone said he was wrong. How many of us have silenced that small voice inside because it seemed foolish or impractical? How many times have we chosen convenience over doing what's right? Mason's story isn't just about a miraculous rescue. It's about the courage to break down walls, both literal and figurative, when something precious lies suffering on the other side. As we watch our grandchildren grow in this complicated world, perhaps our greatest gift to them isn't our protection or